Hello, everyone, and depending where you're calling in from today, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Heather Barnaby, and I am the CEO of Girls 20. We are really excited to be joined by our community all over the globe today for the first web seminar or series that we've actually done. A note that while we are joined by everyone around the globe, the speakers today are really going to be talking about Canada, but I think there'll be a lot of learning for everybody. I did want to also start by acknowledging the land that we are on. We are currently on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I think as we navigate this global crisis together, it's really critical that we're doing our best to ensure that our Indigenous communities across Canada are really being supported. So I'm hopeful that we can touch on a bit of that today as well. For those of you who are new to our community, welcome. A very brief intro about Girls 20 because we have so many speakers and I want to ensure that we get through some of the questions that you have as well. We are a Canadian-based, globally active organization that really aims to place young women in decision-making spaces to change the status quo. So how do we do that? We do that through a few different ways. We do very direct programming as well as advocacy. One of those programs is Girls on Boards, which provides training and mentorship to young female leaders across Canada. And then we actually place them on nonprofit boards as board members. When we began discussing the idea of this webinar, it was really geared towards these young women in the program, who we call young directors. And I believe we have many of them on the call today, so I'm hopeful that this is helpful for them as well. But we also realized that right now we're in a sector-wide challenge and crisis, and we wanted to open this session to our community and beyond. So thank you for joining us today. We were blown away by the amount of people who wanted to participate. Note that we will be announcing additional sessions in this series shortly. So if there's anything that you feel that you'd love for us to talk about, what we can help with, please make sure you reach out on our social media, through our info@girls20.org email, and we'll look to see what we can do. Also note that this is our first time doing something like this, so please bear with us. We are kind of learning as we're going on how to do, big group Zoom calls. And then finally, if you are going to be doing any social media today, we'd love it if you could include the hashtag with Girls20, which you can see on the screen there right now, hopefully. So without further ado, because we have a lot of speakers, we want to make sure we respect everyone's time. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bailey Greenspan.
Thanks, Heather. Just gonna get set up. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is really exciting for us. My name is Bailey Greenspan, and I'm the Director of Programs and Global Engagement at Girls 20, and I'm going to be moderating the discussion for the next 85 minutes or so, the next hour and a half. On our agenda today, we're sort of taking this discussion of nonprofit governance in crisis through three phases. The first phase will be a short conversation about sort of the economic consequences that we're facing right now, the economic downturn. Just get a little bit of context about what we as a country and globally are going through together. We are then going to turn the discussion over to some other experts on the nonprofit sector who are going to talk about the trends that we are seeing in the nonprofit sector right now as a result of COVID-19. And then finally, we're going to bring in some nonprofit leaders from across Canada who are going to speak specifically to how you as nonprofit board members, committee members, volunteers can be supporting your organizations right now. A few housekeeping things before we start. First of all, I just want everyone to take a minute to locate the Q&A box on their screen. So for many of you, it'll be sort of down below. If you're joining from a desktop, it may be above. If you're on your phone, you might have to sort of tap on it to find that. So take a minute to find the Q&A box. Throughout the call, we are encouraging people to ask questions. Please, when you do, try and direct your question to a specific speaker. Our team in the background is going to be pulling all these questions together, and we will get to them at in the Q&A section, which will start at 2:10. And we're going to try to get to everything. So that is for attendees who are in the Zoom call. For anyone who is viewing or streaming this, first of all, thank you so much for participating. Our webinar has a cap of 100 participants. And so we know that there are additional people who are viewing this webinar and are not able to use the Q&A box. So feel free to send us messages via our Twitter at girls20, and we'll also be sharing this recording after. Finally, the one last thing I wanted to mention is that some of you may be aware of this new trend of Zoom bombing. Some people who are at home using this opportunity to maliciously join webinars and share hateful content. This is something that we're aware of, and we're trying our hardest to make sure this doesn't happen in this webinar. So for that reason, all the attendees on this call are muted and their videos are off. So that's why, to ask questions, to please use the Q&A function. We're also monitoring the chat. So if there is any hateful or malicious or anti-feminist messages that are being shared there, that user will be kicked off. All right, that's it for the housekeeping. So before we get started with the first speaker, we just wanted to get a sense of who is in the quote unquote room with us today. So take a look at your screen, and I'm gonna launch a poll. Are you involved with a nonprofit, and in which capacity? So go ahead and vote on that. All right, I'm ending polling and sharing the results. So you should be able to see we have a mix of people joining us as nonprofit employees, 18%, board members, 39%, committees or volunteers, 25%, and people who are not currently involved in the nonprofit sector. So glad that you wanted to join this call anyway, 18%. Okay. So I'm gonna bring on our first guest, David O'Leary. So David, I'm asking you to start your video and requesting that you unmute. There we go. Perfect. Hey, David, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Really good, thank you.
Good.
So David is the founder and principal at Kind Wealth, and has been providing a lot of guidance to folks navigating this period of time in terms of their finances and navigating the economy. And so we've asked David to join us for 10 minutes to give us a high level kind of picture of what's happening right now. So David, my first question, which is a question I've been sort of struggling with all week, is what do we call this this economic situation that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, it's a good question. Finding the right words to articulate what's going on is certainly helpful and can bring some comfort when you sort of know what's going on and happening. I think this is what I would say is that this is unprecedented. Nobody who's alive right now has experienced anything like this before, exactly like this, and particularly from kind of the investment perspective. There's questions about whether this is a downturn or a recession, or I don't think anybody's talking about a depression. And these all have very, I think, fairly standard definitions in economic terms, which I won't belabor, but I would say it's none of those. And I am sort of thinking about it in my mind, a metaphor that keeps coming up is kind of rebooting a computer. And I think what we were probably, hopefully, the best case is that it is a reboot. You know, when you sort of have the option to, you want to shut down or reboot, and the reboot's just sort of like quickly goes off and then we put it back on. And I think that's what we're going to try to engineer here, right? Is everyone has to stay home. No one, shutting down all the businesses except for essential businesses. So the economy grinds to a halt when that happens, because nobody can all sorts of industries can no longer buy and sell from one another. And then hopefully we can get this under control, get it behind us, and then start the economy back up. And the less time we're shut down, the better. And the more likely I think we are to be able to rebound quickly and get things going again. So hopefully this is a reboot and not a shutdown. If the longer that we have to stop things and keep it shut off, I think the more uncertain it becomes around how quickly, how much permanent damage gets done and how quickly we can rebound from it.
Interesting. And I think so other than the amount of time that we're at home, which is to a certain extent outside of our control, are there things that are within our control that will determine whether it is a reboot or a shutdown?
No, I mean, I think, so I would say how quickly they can come up with a vaccine to, it all, from an economic standpoint, it is, I think there's two things: how quickly we can get business going again, but that is integrally, tightly linked to, how much we stay home, but also how much we save lives. I mean, ultimately, there's a bit of a false dichotomy, like, do we sacrifice the economy or do we save lives? And they're actually linked together. I mean, we've seen data actually from, it's old data and it's a little more crude, but from the Spanish flu around, those countries and those places that actually did a better job of isolating and flattening their curve actually rebounded more strongly once they got back to normal than those that had tried to resist it and kept interacting and kept business going. So shutting down business in this case actually will be good long-term for the economy. So I think the only thing that we can do is all avoid getting sick, try to flatten that curve as quick as possible so that we can get business going, but not to try to keep the lights on and to keep working throughout all of this. That'll make it worse.
Okay. That is, that's more optimistic than I thought I was going to hear today. So I'm happy to hear that. David, there are a number of young people on this call, many in university or sort of beginning to navigate early careers. Is there anything that any changes that young people should be especially aware of right now or especially concerned about?
Yeah, so I mean, I would paint, I'm an optimist by nature, but I do think that it's not helpful to sort of only paint the optimistic picture and try to put a smile on everything in this situation. So, my general philosophy is hope for the best and expect the worst. So I'm prepared for the worst case if it happens, but I'm not going to dwell on it and make that my primary focus. I'm going to try to manage and control those things that I do have control over, as to your previous question. And so I think that things can get a lot worse. I mean, I think that it's entirely possible that the market falls a lot further than it does from here, that countries don't sufficiently get on top of the spread of the virus, that more people die than otherwise should if they were, people were staying home and staying away from others. And so, don't prepare yourself for, what if this lasts a year and a half, 2 years, what will I do? And so thinking about that, I think, is important. But again, I don't think that's what I'm expecting. And so don't let that derail you and send you into negative thought patterns, but just sort of thinking about what is your worst case scenario and how do you sort of protect yourself and your organization, your small business from that. I think also look for the opportunity. I mean, so I would say this in two ways. One is, how can I generate some income? What can I be working on? How can I up my skills? If you can't generate any income, there's no ways to do that. And I think people are resourceful. They'll find ways to start, adapting. And the longer this goes on, in the event, right, this doesn't turn around quickly and we don't get back to work by June, July, let's say, that you are thinking about, and you've got some other ideas and working on some other things that A, might, give you some sort of income potential, or B, just improving your skills. And so if that's from the perspective of as a board member, a nonprofit, can you be supporting nonprofits or businesses or anything that builds the skill set that you want, that will ultimately, when things do turn back on again, even if there's no money to be made from those things while we were shut down, will put you in a better position when we come out of this, that you took that time and used it very productively. And the second part of that, I would say, is look for how, if you feel like, when you feel like you're okay, you've thought about your worst case scenario, I think I'm going to be okay, I can work on these things, here's how I can make the best of the situation. Stop and look around it. And I think this group is probably already doing that. You probably wouldn't be here on this call if you weren't, but stop and look around at others and see who's not doing as well as you and who's struggling, and offer to lend a hand. And I think that's also just selfishly good for you, because it keeps you productive and motivated and thinking, and being constructive rather than dwelling on the negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, David. If there's any questions that want to come in for David, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A, and we do have time for one. David unfortunately won't be able to stick around for our longer Q&A section at the end. So yeah, if you have any questions sort of about what the
While you're waiting to see if there's a question come through, I'll just add one thing, like, and this is just getting maybe a little more of a personal note for everybody who's listening.
Yeah.
That it's a scary time for a lot of people. So if you're feeling scared, anxious, nervous, hopefully not ashamed or embarrassed of your personal financial situation, just know that there's a lot of us in it. There's very few people who are untouched by this. Certainly from a health perspective, it's a risk to all of us. From a financial perspective, there's very few of us who are not impacted by this. And so you're not alone. And if you, if you're feeling that way, reach out and talk to somebody. We actually have got a group of professionals we've organized that are having pro bono consultations for anybody who's really wants a little bit of guidance and direction from a financial perspective. So just know that you're not alone. These feelings are normal. I think a lot of us are shell shocked right now. And so it's not just you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. One quick question. If we have about 30 seconds
Sure.
left, are there any specific skills that you believe are important to improve on right now? Are there any skills that on the other end of this, when we reboot, will be especially valuable?
That's a hard question to answer in 30 seconds. The first thing that comes to mind, though, is I feel like relationships are just so incredibly important. And that's something that, especially now, you can do a lot of relationship building. Some people have extra time on their hands because they're stuck at home. People are jumping on video calls. I'm getting a lot more people reaching out to me and connecting with me and catching up. So take some time, if nothing else, if it's not a hard skill you're building, build your social skills and build your relationships, and really look out for those. And you can, that's going to just, like, A, it's good for you, and B, there's all sorts of good that can come from that, both personally and what you can provide for others. And so it's like one of those win-wins. So I would double down on building relationships.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you, David. And David, we've posted your Twitter and LinkedIn in case anyone wants to reach out and learn more about how they could get some guidance or advice from you.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for dropping in.
My pleasure.
Okay, take care. Okay. All right, so that is the first sort of section. And now we are going to bring on Cathy Taylor. Cathy, I'm asking you to start your video, and Paul Nazareth. Great. Hi, Cathy and Paul. How are you guys doing?
I'm good, Bailey. How are you doing?
Good. Well, I feel a little more optimistic after that, sort of thinking about the reboot, not the shutdown. Yeah, giving me a little optimism. So we have with us now Cathy Taylor, who is the Executive Director of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and Paul Nazareth, who is the VP at Canadian Association of Gift Planners. So I'm going to pose this question to both of you. Maybe Cathy, you can take it first, and it's a big one. How has the nonprofit sector been affected by the pandemic and the economic downturn in the past few weeks?
That is a big question because really it's been the last 4 weeks, and I can speak to the Canadian and Ontario experience so far, and I know colleagues around the world are maybe ahead of us or behind us depending on where the pandemic is in their communities. But our sector has been very hard hit. both in terms of revenues, fundraising events canceled, donations drying up, project fees, art, for example, arts organizations, festivals have closed down, theaters, sport programming. So there's a combination of a loss of revenues, the impact on the human resources. Volunteering has almost entirely stopped, except for virtual volunteering, because of the safety around required for volunteer activities. And organizations are closing their doors and laying off staff. So this is a complete crisis, frankly, for the nonprofit sector and charitable sector in Canada, as we think about what the roles that they play and what they need to go forward in terms of their future. And I think the other piece is that the organizations that are essential, that are staying open, the shelters, the food banks, residential programs for people with disabilities, for example, hospices, those organizations are struggling in a different way, because they're trying to keep the doors open and provide their services. They actually need extra staffing and more volunteers and additional resources, and are dealing with situations that they've never, you can plan for in a business continuity plan, but to actually live it is a very experience. So there's an unevenness about how the sector is affected as well.
And Cathy, maybe you can give us just a bit of a sense of how big is the sector in Ontario, and if you can also speak to Canada. How many people are employed? What is the contribution to Canada's GDP?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Ontario, there's 58,000 nonprofits, which includes nonprofits and charities. The third of Canada's sector is here in Ontario. Altogether, there's about 180,000 nonprofits and charities in Canada. And here in Ontario, 1 million people work in the nonprofit sector. So about 600,000 full-time and 400,000 part-time. So it's actually bigger than other industries like the mining sector and the automotive industry, and about 8% of our GDP. So it is quite a substantial sector. So as an industry, very much like the small business sector, we're facing a lot of the same concerns that they are right now, and differentiating between what's an essential business and what's a non-essential service.
Okay, thank you for that. That sort of is sort of shocking when you compare it to the automotive sector. That there are more people employed than the automotive sector, which is, we know, despite struggles, sort of has a lot of lobbying power and has has quite a lot of support. Wow, that's incredible. Thank you, Cathy. And Paul, I'm gonna turn this question over to you. And I know that you're coming from, from the fundraising world. You sort of have a different perspective, or a different side of the perspective. So how have you seen the nonprofit sector being affected in the last few weeks?
And, that's exactly the other side of the coin. Whereas Cathy's team has this much bigger picture view on the needs of the sector, and a lot of the responses and things, are the CGP's focus on the fundraising side, and we're unique in that we look towards all of the different types of revenue. So not just the special events and traditional fundraising, we exist to be the bridge between our world of charity and actually David's world of finance, and the donations of things like stocks, property, all that kind of thing. And so all of the lines of capital have completely shut down, right? Fundraising field has shut down its ability to raise funds, especially through special events and gathering, which this is the challenge. We're over leveraged as a sector towards gathering special events and fundraising. And you add to that the ability that the capital markets, and a lot of what our organization does is to help charities and donors understand their ability through tax and finance that they can give. And all of those different capital markets, so donations of stocks and securities, as the market has crashed, all of those kind of donations have virtually shut off. And the ability to transfer different types of assets and major donations have virtually shut off. So it is a standstill when it comes to the flow of capital. And again, as Cathy shared, when it comes to responding to that need, that only exacerbates the crisis. The good news is, and this was my previous role before CGP, I spent almost 5 years as the vice president of Canada Helps, the online giving platform, which we work with 20. Online giving as a response has wonderfully exploded. And Canadians are looking to care, they want to help, but of course the challenge is they don't know how and where to help. So people are often giving to what is that the response that they can understand, things like food banks and that frontline social service piece. But as Cathy's team knows, it's so much more complex. And in fact, this is an area where Ontario Nonprofit Network has really led the way much before all this, talking about decent work and the structure of the sector. We now, in this crisis, it's women and girls that are affected the most. And the challenges for a lot of the public who are trying to give, who are actually, it's really wonderful to see, beating down the doors to give in a lot of these spaces, but there isn't that easy way to communicate where it needs to match in those different spaces. So
Paul, I'm gonna cut you off for 1 minute because you said so many interesting things. So I'm gonna hop back to 2 points ago, which is just talking a little bit about sort of how stocks and securities, sort of like what role that plays in the nonprofit sector. I think many of us, because we engage with it every day, are aware of online giving and are aware of, you know, attending fundraisers and events. But sort of what is the scale of, or the role of stocks and securities being donated to the nonprofit sector?
So previous to this crisis, stocks and securities were the single most tax-effective way to give in Canada for the past decade or so. So we got this benefit in 2007. The government gave the ability for Canadians to be able to give, get a full tax receipt, but also eliminate the capital gains on stocks when they give. So if you had stocks 10 years ago, they were worth $100. You have them today, they're worth $1,000. When you sell them, you have to pay the tax on the difference. That's capital gain. But if you donate those stocks in kind, in stock form, to a charity, and again, Girls 20 did a great project around this, you don't have to pay the taxes on that gain. So actually, there's a lot of people out there, and again, this affects people of all ages who may inherit stocks from family, et cetera, not just having a portfolio, but they're able to give and get a bigger tax benefit. So it was a huge driver of donations for the past decade. But again, in this crisis, with the market crashing and resources and blue chip and banks and all of that, it's virtually turned off. And in fact, as we start to reach out to the actual financial markets and the processors, they even tell us, well, the offices are shut down. So even if people wanted to do it and donate at a loss, because donors are generous and they want to be there, they actually physically couldn't if they wanted to. Our challenge right now, even the physicality of giving has been shut down.
Thanks, Paul. Well, you brought up decent work, and I wanted to ask Cathy a little bit about the human resources sort of toll of this pandemic. 1 million, I just learned this number, and now I'm going to share it. Now I'm going to say it all the time. 1 million people are employed in the nonprofit sector in Ontario. Can you speak a little bit about to the human resources fallout?
Yeah, for sure. And this is honestly what's keeping us up at night these days. We know that organizations, even in the last 3 weeks, and it seems like such a short period, doesn't it? How, you know, when everything really hit in Canada was only in early March, have laid off organizations. We heard just this morning from the YMCA, they've laid off 75% of their staff across Canada. Other big organizations are laying off staff, small organizations are. Everything from the Stratford Festival to the local theater organization and everything in between. So we know that there are significant short-term layoffs. We don't know what short-term looks like in this context yet as we go forward. At this point, we can't really put a number on it, but we're anticipating a high percentage of the sector will be either temporarily laid off or move to a 4-day work week or have a reduction in salaries because of the revenues for our sector are drying up, as Paul has indicated, from that perspective. So we're worried, and that worries us on a couple levels. One, 80% of the workers in the nonprofit sector are women. And so those women are often breadwinners for their family. They are the ones that are doing the direct service work, our immigrant services, our PSWs, our frontline service work. And so we're quite concerned about what this means for our communities and for our families as they struggle with not having income in the next while. We also know the toll when we think in the nonprofit sector, our human resources includes volunteers. And Canada has a predominance of older volunteers. A lot of the volunteers we have are older, they're retired. They're the ones that have been contributing to food banks and all of those types of organizations. And they're staying home now, rightly so. They need to, not be out and about. And that's having a dramatic impact as well on everything from driving, cancer patients to their appointments, which still exist, to maintaining some of the food delivery systems. And so we're really struggling with how to support organizations to keep their staff, if they do have to lay it off, how to do it appropriately and respectfully, how to communicate effectively. And I would say that the number one issue that we're hearing from nonprofits and charities is around how to handle these HR needs in such a short period of time, because most of our sector are small to medium-sized organizations, less than 10 staff or less than 20 staff. They don't have a full-time HR manager on the team. They really do. They don't have that kind of expertise quickly to figure out how to put all these systems in place. So there's many of us that are trying to help them find those supports, but it is something that it really keeps us, as I mentioned, keeps us awake at night. And particularly as we get to a recovery period, which we will, how quickly will we be able to ramp up? Will those employees still be there? Will they still want to work in our sector? Will young people want to work in our sector as we move forward? Those are some of the things that we really have to think about and plan for.
That's sobering. Thank you, Cathy. And I think for many who are on the call who are working in the sector or hope to work in the sector, it's important to be armed with that knowledge. And I want to ask, sort of in that recovery and looking towards getting back up to sort of full employment in the sector, and what would the role of foundations or some of our sort of reliable funders be to get us there?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you want to start, Paul?
Yeah, because it's funding. And, we've seen, and it's been quite encouraging to see that a lot of the foundations, both the community foundation movement and also the private foundation movement, have realized, all right, we've been saving this money for what kind of rainy day? It's time to start digging into the endowment and start doing major granting and response. So right now what we're seeing is the response, and it's very exciting across the country. I was looking at one today in Kitchener-Waterloo. We've seen a coalition of the Community Foundation, United Way, several private foundations to say, let's pool the money, let's get deploying. And in BC, same kind of thing. Victoria has launched a crowdfunded community response, $4 million in 4 days they've raised, and they're getting out to deploy. Wow. This is really kicking up that entrepreneurial mindset in the response side. The next phase will be rebuilding to see what kind of capital deployment. But again, this is where we'll look to organizations like ONN in Ontario and others to understand, what does the new normal look like? Let's not rebuild it the way it was the way before that wasn't working. So work stronger governance. That's where the people on this call are going to be needed. It's going to be an opportunity to get on boards, to really put forward your knowledge and your understanding of what could be built better. That's going to be the strongest opportunity in the rebuild, and then hopefully also the rework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I would say that funders are really stepping up. They're providing more flexible funding, everything from postponing grant deadlines and applications and reporting to allowing organizations to move money to different. Not across the board, but there's so many excellent examples. And I think what is hopeful about this moment is the collectivism and collaboration that is emerging, and the parking of egos and logos, as one of my colleagues calls it, as organizations really figure out what is essential and what's needed to do, and how do we keep the sector working.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that perfectly sort of tees up the last question I had for you both, with 3 minutes left to explore this question. Paul, I'm really heartened by what you just said, which is, we're going to use this opportunity to build a better sector. So can you both tell me a little bit about what that will be sort of in the next 12 months? What are we advocating for through this time and as we begin to enter our recovery?
Cathy, you've been leading the way. I'd love if you started.
Yeah, no, it's some days I think I can't even think past getting to lunch, forget about, you know, the next 12 months, because there's so many urgent priorities, and I know we all feel that way. But I think it's so important to think about what can this look like in the future. There's no doubt that this crisis has shone a light on some of the systemic issues that our sectors face that we know weren't working. You know, things like the overhead myth and, you know, not allowing organizations to have reserve funds or surpluses.
Sorry, for those on the call who aren't familiar with that, could you just explain what that means?
Sure. Yeah, the overhead myth is a term that's used to basically explain that, you know, a lot of funders, including governmental funders and non-government, assume that organizations can pay all of their costs, their rent, their staffing, their insurance, their bookkeeping, from some magical pot of money, and that their funding only is going to programs and only going to, you know, services. Not understanding that in order to run a program or service, an organization does have to have all of those other costs of keeping the organization afloat. And so there are some systemic issues about our sector, and lots of funders have rules that you can't have more than 3-month reserve funds in the bank, or that you shouldn't spend money on technology or, you know, laptops or computer equipment. And that's coming back to bite us. And I think there's already a sense that, you know what, the new normal includes, we need to invest in technology. We need to have remote from work home opportunities. We need to have reserve funds. We need to have more flexible funding, not more restricted funding, so that when a crisis happens, we can move the money around as we see fit. And we need a home in government, and both at the provincial level and at the national level. Government doesn't have a ministry or minister responsible for nonprofits and charities, and it's making it very difficult for them to make public policy decisions without that. So I'm excited, actually, that the phase of rebuilding will mean that we can really shine a light on some of the things that haven't worked for our sector and recreate it in a way that might help us be stronger in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Cathy.
I'll just us, we're really just supporting as many funders and entrepreneurs as we can who say we want to respond to get connected to the right partners, right? So we had an insurance company walk out of the mist, this team called Gore Mutual Insurance, who went to Canada Helps and said, you know what, we want to help with the response. We're going to put $2 million cash on the table to match donations to response to COVID right now. And so on Monday, they launched 2 funds, a public fund for charities and a fund for healthcare. And this random insurance company said, we will match cash right now. So the start of this response from a funding side, we're just trying to make the collaborative connection so that we don't start new charities, start new foundations that aren't needed. There's a lot of partnership that can happen. And then we're following the blueprint that's laid down from a rebuilding perspective by partners like ONN and Imagine Canada. You know, I've seen ONN's, you know, the work of Pamela Uppel on diesel work, but the actual blueprints, the board checklist, the employment checklist, even the hiring guidelines, this was all built in the past 18 months. There was so much consultation and, you know, risk management, all of that. That's what's going to be the blueprint when we get the money to rebuild on a stronger foundation.
Thank you. Well, thank you both so much for this. This is like really perfectly teeing up the next phase of our conversation, which is hearing from those nonprofit leaders who are on the ground. So I'm going to turn off both of your cameras, but we're going to keep Paul and Cathy around. There's some amazing questions coming in through the Q&A, and we'll bring them back after the next phase in the conversation to get into some of these things a little bit more deeply. Thank you both.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. So finally, we're bringing our 3 final guests. So as I ask you to start your video, you'll receive a prompt. Wonderful. And Margie, if you can unmute yourself, and Salima, unmute yourself. Fantastic. Hey, everyone. They've been patiently sitting here. I'm sure they're really ready to dive in. So we have with us, we have Margie Parekh, MBA Director, Board Director. She's joining us from Victoria, BC. We have Kelly Potvin, Executive Director of the Elizabeth Fry Toronto. And we have Salima Rauji, a director for the Toronto Foundation, Civic Action, and Civic Action Leadership Foundation, also joining us from Toronto. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So I'm going to start with Kelly. Kelly is our today our resident executive director. No doubt is up to her eyeballs in work right now. So thank you so much for joining us. Kelly, I'm wondering if you can take us to the front lines and share how your organization has been impacted and has been responding in the last few weeks.
Sure, thanks. So at Elizabeth Fry Toronto, we're a direct service organization. So we serve women, non-binary folk who are in conflict with the law, at risk of being in conflict of the law. And we have several forms of funding, both municipal, federal, provincial, and we rely on fundraising as well as, we have a internally restricted fund that we rely on some of the revenue from that for our annual budget. So we have, all kinds of service disruptions as well as, things that we have to keep our eyes on in terms of our revenues and our ability to continue to deliver service. So far, we haven't had any cuts to any funding, any of our government funding. We've actually been, government has been really understanding and they've been really supportive and they really don't want us to lay anybody off. But I think providing direct service, and we do run one program that is an essential service right now, is really difficult. We've had to, a lot of our face-to-face counseling has had to move to telephone counseling. We run, a lot of our programs are group or classroom based. We can't hold those. We've moved some of them to Zoom. One of the things that we're really conscious of, and we don't have a workaround, is that most of the women we serve live in poverty. They may not have a phone. If they have a phone, and if it's a smartphone, they might not have data. They might have not. Places where they could access data, like a Tim Hortons or a public library, are closed. They have no access to that. There are a large number of people who are struggling with substance abuse issues, mental health issues. They may be homeless or underhoused. Social distancing is not possible for this population. They're one of, we deal with the population that is really going to be very impacted by this pandemic. And there are no simple solutions. So we're doing the best that we can, given balancing, keeping our staff safe and working within occupational health and safety legislation, and doing our bit to flatten the curve. We have a residential facility here where women are living, and there are women who are coming to us from both provincial and federal corrections. Elizabeth Fry Toronto is part of a national network, so there are Elizabeth Frys across the country, and we have a national office that is calling for the decarceration of women, especially during the pandemic, because in prison, social distancing is not possible. Once there's an infection in our correctional institutions, we're putting many women at risk of death disproportionately to the rest of the population, because healthcare in the institutions is not what you get in most of our provinces. So I know Bill Blair has called on the government to start to move people out of prisons. But I think, and so we're here, we have this facility, and we're, we have been accepting women out of prison. We've been working with the parole board to move women onto full parole so they can be reunited with their families, to bring new women here from the institution. And we're balancing, so here's this large organization, and we have some appointment-based counselors, and we have a 24/7 residence. And we have two types of counselors. We have a class of counselors who are essential service, and they have to come to work. They have to interface with our clients. We have another class of workers who we've told to work from home. So that, like, even in our organization, that has created a bit of a tension that we've had to walk through, talk about. I mean, my work increased exponentially with this pandemic. So,
well, I think that navigating new policies, new work from home policies of and HR practices, as well as navigating, heartened to hear that the government funding is continuing to be consistent, but we know for so many other organizations, funding is being lost left, right, and center. Margie, I wanted to ask, as a longtime board member and governance expert, what is the role of a board member right now during the time of a crisis?
Yeah, Bailey, so there's so much to talk about, and I'll try not to just roll through it really quickly, but one thing we know for sure is that good communication is critical, and we've heard that from the previous speakers, but as Paul really said very eloquently, people are stressed and worried and have no idea what the impact will be. And leadership, the board and the ED and senior staff, needs to be honest and authentic. And it's okay to admit that we haven't figured everything out. And we don't have all the answers. And that really helps keep the trust and probably build the trust for that rebuilding phase. So, what do we need to do as board members? I would say the first is to be thoughtful. There's a temptation to just jump right in and say, I can help. And that's wonderful, but realize that people are already working really hard and under duress. So what can you do? You need to be alert to what else is happening around you. We aren't the first, probably. There are other organizations, similar organizations. Do your own homework. Look at what they're doing. Think about what practices or what emails you received, because I'm sure everyone's received a lot. I even got one from Kijiji, and what did you like? What resonated with you? What mistakes have been made? Learn from that, and remember, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So my first message would be to be thoughtful. The second really is don't underestimate the organization's preparedness. Mm-hmm. If you haven't, as a director, already seen crisis plans or an emergency succession plan, which deals with, what if your ED is suddenly out of commission for a couple weeks or a month? Hopefully that's not the first time you're hearing about that, but even if you you haven't engaged in it, doesn't mean that your organization hasn't. So don't underestimate. Most organizations have done some kind of crisis planning, and probably not around a pandemic, but around something where staff are impacted, systems are impacted, supply chain is impacted. And for example, in BC, most organizations have some kind of plan for if there's a major earthquake and your systems are down or your people can't come into work. Mm-hmm. And every nonprofit that I have worked with has either faced or at least modeled revenue loss. You lose a government grant, you lose a contract. So those scenarios have been worked through. So again, seek to understand what your organization has already thought about and what's in place. So that's the second thing. Mm-hmm. The third is to balance your responsibility as a director for oversight with burden. So it kind of gets back to the first one, but your job is not to micromanage, it's to gain reasonable assurance. So whether crisis or not, there's times when you're going to disagree with an approach that's being taken. And I'm not saying don't say anything about it. I'm saying there are ways to present your thoughts that are, let's say, more thoughtful. For example, let's say there's an approach and you don't think that's the right way to go. Instead of saying, I think we should do this, what you could say is, tell me more about what you're planning. Or have you considered, and then introduce your idea. Chances are you'll probably be surprised. Your leadership team, the organization probably has thought about most of those things. Or they may say, oh, that's a really good idea, we'll look into that. So it's just a non-binary way to present an idea. So balance that. And then I would say, going back to something I think that Cathy mentioned, crisis also presents opportunities. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's first of all, it does really test your leaders. And it's a way to understand, who's got it and what they've got. And I'm not saying, okay, this is your opportunity to get rid of people, but rather this is an opportunity to say, where can we do more professional development or personal development? And as an organization, where are the cracks? How prepared were you?
Right.
I work with one board, for example, where we have a very, very robust risk management team, and it's amazing. They get together regularly. They roll it up to the board. They're already looking at, okay, what did we miss? Yeah, okay. Not saying we missed a pandemic, but where are the cracks showing up? Mm-hmm. So that's the fourth thing. And I think the last thing is to be supportive. Mm-hmm. Be supportive of your ED, be supportive of staff, be supportive of each other. Yeah. And don't underestimate your organization or your own ability. Mm-hmm. Lots of things, Bailey.
Thanks, Margie. I'm going to come back to one of the things that you said in a few minutes, but I just wanted to turn that question to Salima, but also ask Salima. There are many, many young people and young women, especially on this call, who have been on boards for maybe 2 years, maybe 6 months, maybe 3 months. Yeah. What is the role right now of someone who is young and newly nominated on a board in a time of crisis?
Well, I think I have sort of a 3-part answer to this question, which is, first, remember that you're there for a reason. They chose you, they invited you to be part of this governance, and what skills got you there are still relevant today, even though we're in the middle of a totally changing and dynamic situation. Mm-hmm. David opened our webinar today by saying no living person has experienced something like this. So do not feel that your skill set is not relevant. It absolutely is, and that's why they brought you there. I would say the second part is to Margie's point, and considering all the things that she laid out, but continue to ask the questions that come to mind. Even if they seem obvious to you, your perspective is unique to you, and it may not be obvious to others. And so if it's something that you're wondering about, if it's something that you're thinking about, ask. Don't be shy to ask. Do it respectfully, be alert, make sure you're informed. We are in a moment of kind of media overload, and so be mindful of your mental health, but make sure you are informed. If you're going to be bringing issues forward, then take it upon yourself to be informed about those issues, but raise the questions. Because sometimes a question coming from a different set of language or a different perspective, even though it may be something that someone's considered, can open up creativity, can spark an idea that may not have been there prior. And I think that that's a responsibility as a board member to make sure that you're raising those things that are in your mind. It's a fiduciary obligation, actually. And last, this is our world. This is our world more than anyone older than us. And we will live with the consequences of decisions made today. We will live with the organizations that survive, and we will repair those that don't. And so think about what world you want. What are things that you don't like about today? Paul mentioned, this new normal. What are ideas that perhaps yesterday you raised and weren't accepted, but in today's reality, maybe? People are, I think, going to be open to fresh perspectives and thinking much more than they were in yesterday's world. And I see this even just in my own family where, we are forced now in self-isolation to take up technology and tools and things that we didn't yesterday want to and didn't have to. People are being forced into uncomfortable zones. And when they get into that mindset, I do think that their minds open. And I think that's an opportunity for our younger board members to take advantage of some of that openness and be able to shape the future that they want.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Salima. So Kelly, our resident executive director, from your perspective, dealing with your board right now, what is a supportive board right now? And also, maybe speaking hypothetically, is there anything that is really not supportive right now for an ED?
Well, first of all, I would welcome Margie or Salima on my board any day, because both of what they said is helpful and not helpful resonates really well with me. But I think one of the things that I found, we had in place an emergency preparedness plan, and we had a pandemic plan that was part of that. And in reviewing them during these past few weeks, they were not helpful. And we're not alone in seeing that. And I think, sometimes board members will say, well, we had a plan, why didn't it work? Or somehow, there was a fault that we should have been planning differently or better or something. And I think that we all just need to give ourselves a pass on this one. I don't think, this has never happened before. There were a few times, and I think I've been here at eFry Toronto for 3 years, but I've been an executive director in the not-for-profit for 15. So I'm pretty confident in my decision making, and I feel like I can make sound decisions that I can later back up to my board. And there have been days where I've had to make really fast decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that I could justify those decisions. And I told my board about them after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I did so, thinking that it was the right thing to do, and it was important to act fast, and that I was prepared to ask for forgiveness instead of permission, because I didn't have time. And I think my board has been extremely understanding, and then I did have, a good rationale for the decisions that I did make on the fly, and I did make them within budget and within my scope. But it would have been something normally I would have, under normal circumstances, I would have at least had a conversation with my executive or something like that. So I'm getting a lot of understanding around slightly different behavior, because we're very different circumstances. And I think that's really important for a board. And I think if you had an executive director who doesn't have 15 years of experience, you might actually be busier, because you might have an executive director who's calling you to say, I don't know what to do right now, because, this is like beyond my depth. And so I could see myself even 10 years ago, having those thoughts and wanting to call board members for help and just to talk something through, not because I need the answer, but I need help in getting to the answer. So I think those are kind of the things I could think of that my present self and my younger self would need from a board.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kelly. And Salima, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that it's really important right now, and I think this has been mentioned, but that as board members, that we really trust management. They are the ones that are managing, and then there's that difference between the managing and the governing. And so knowing who your executive directors, your CEOs are going to turn to for help. Are there delegated people on the board that have been assigned that role of this is who management goes to when they have questions? Those types of conversations I think are important. At the Toronto Foundation, when we were speaking about this panel, one of the things that Sharon Avery, our CEO, said is what she's appreciated from our board is that, we've changed the delegation of authority. And we've changed we've allowed for flexibility and nimbleness in the organization. And I think she didn't say this, but I would speak on behalf of the board to say that there's a trust there. And that trust has been earned over, the great work that staff has done. And it's for moments like this. For Civic Action, we're in a totally different scenario where our CEO left us at the end of December, and so we're actually working with an interim CEO. And so there, our board knows that the chair has taken on a really heavy duty role where, she's paying a lot more attention than she would be in the past. And they look completely different, but both organizations, I think, are responding in appropriate and in really great ways, but the structure of how the board has responded looks different in both scenarios, given what was happening with management at the time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Salima. So both of you have really highlighted this role that is especially important, I think, for younger board members to be playing right now, which is to be asking questions, especially probably those questions that seem obvious or you think like just might be, yeah, it might be an obvious question, but in fact now is the time to be asking it. Are there a few examples, things that you can think of right now that a young board member should be asking the board or asking the executive director?
I'll jump in on that. You know, off the top of my head, I would say there's a lot of different technological solutions out there right now. And not to say that just because you're young, you know more about it, but chances are you do, or you've interacted more. You know, offering some support. So again, it's really in how you ask your questions and how you ask your offer. So rather than, I think we should use this, you know, I can help. You can ask your ED, you know, do you need any help assessing some of the technology out there? You know, that's an area where you may be able to contribute. But I also really like what Salima said in terms of, you know, don't pigeonhole yourself just because you're young, you're like this, you know, you by definition bring a different perspective. So I think just even making the offer, you know, as Kelly said, sometimes someone might just want to bounce an idea. They're not asking you for permission. They're not this. Being available just because you're a younger director does not make that your ability to contribute in that way smaller. In fact, it could be refreshing for the ED. So be available, make that offer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Did either of you also want to add anything else? Just sort of questions or things to be looking for right now?
I think it's just, it's a hard time for everyone, right? Going through these changes. Everyone is going through probably mental health challenges, probably challenges with their family, with income, with people that they know. We're focused so much in today's conversation, of course, on the nonprofit sector, but the same conversation is happening in every sector. And so for me, and maybe this is useful for the other directors out there, having an opportunity to focus on something that will have positive output to other people has been a savior for me myself. And perhaps it's a chance to dig in a little bit more into something with a positive outcome.
I just want to add that on my current board, we have a board member from Girls 20, and I think I don't think of her input and her contribution as anything different from any of my other board members. I think she's equally as supportive and has, you know, from time to time maybe more insight into some of our work, because she's closer in age to so many of my staff. She's closer in age to so many of our clients. You know, I just think of her as another board member. I don't know, who has her own particular lens on the world, as do most of my board members, right? Depending on where they're coming from.
Thanks for saying that, Kelly. And that's a very nice testimonial for Michelle, who's a part of our program, who has been a very eager member of your board.
She's an amazing board member.
So this question came in from another executive director who was unable to join, but wanted to know, how can the board be supporting the financial health and revenue generation of the organization right now? And I'll put that out if anyone wants to hop onto it.
Well, you know, we're in right now. We just ended our fiscal, and we're you know, preparing budget for approval. It's a little bit late, but you know, so we have, you know, a budget line of donations, foundations, and another one that's revenue from our internally restricted fund, and those are big question marks. We're putting in numbers that I have. It feels like a shot in the dark what that number is going to be. We can't use past year comparables. We have no idea, and so, you know, I've put a number in that budget, and you know, everyone has to know that we have no idea. It's like budgeting in the dark. And those, like, if you add those 3 budget lines, that's a pretty significant amount of revenue that we have no idea if we'll get or not. But, you know, thankfully, and most nonprofits have at least an internally restricted fund that we'll be able to lean on for the year, but to have that understanding that, you know, as we go through this coming fiscal, that, you know, anybody's guess, these numbers are, we've tried to keep them conservative, but they might still be too high. Who knows?
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for the honesty. Margie, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so first of all, I completely agree. So my job as a director is partially to be flexible. It could be flexible, as I think Salima said, in changing authority, delegation of authority, or limits. Could be around whether you're using restricted funds. And one of the things I told one of my CEOs who was hesitant to give us an update on the finances is really clearly say, nobody's holding you to these numbers. You know, we don't know, as Kelly said. So we need to not only say that, but actually believe it. And then I think there are other things, you know, we need to be, going back to my earlier point about communication, we need to be open and honest with our donors, because even if they may not be able to donate this year, or other supporters, they might be next year, or when things bounce back. So that maintaining and building the trust and building your brand is really important. And as a director, you know, if you can, maybe you make a donation to your organization. It's not possible for everybody, but if it is, you know, why not? So again, it goes back to that being supportive and saying well done.
I think I'm just gonna reiterate that in case anyone missed it. What Margie's saying is that for board governors or board directors who can, to make a donation to their organization right now, and that would really help the executive directors and CEOs quite a bit. Just making sure everyone heard that.
Just one thing I want to, like, just jumping on what Margie said is one of the things that we're doing right now is we're calling all of our donors, and it's not an ask call. We're just calling them to say we're thinking about you right now. It's a hard time for everyone. How are you managing? And you know, thanks for your support in the past, and you know, want to continue the relationship. But I think with this, with everyone having to be socially distant, I think a phone call is, in this time, as part of your stewardship for next year, is really important. And actually, I get my board members to help with those calls. I'm a board member from eFry Toronto, and we have a phone list and we break it up. So that's another thing that so that I don't have to make all the calls that I've had my board help with.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a really great way that anyone on the board can be helping you. And I think it goes so far to receive a call from a board member knowing how busy everyone is right now. Yeah. Salima, did you, I saw you sort of gearing up. Did you want to also add to this conversation?
I would say not so much from a financial perspective, because that is, I think, been covered off really well. But at this moment, maybe digging a little bit deeper into your network, into places that may have synergies that may be more willing to give at this point. I had a really great, a different organization, but a really great Zoom call yesterday with a theater organization in Toronto who is looking for a pop-up space to do work, and had been at this for a year and just had no success. And yesterday was able to have a breakthrough, because I think, just to my earlier point, that in these moments, I think people's hearts and minds are a little bit more open. And so just to be maybe thinking about revisiting some of those in-kind conversations, or thinking about your network and maybe reminding those people about the work that you're trying to do with your board and your organization could have a different level of success now than it had in the past.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Salima. So I don't know if it felt like that for you, because the time just flew by, but that is the 30-minute segment that we had. So I want to open the floor to Q&A. There are so many good questions coming in. I'm also going to bring Cathy and Paul back into this discussion. So I'm just sending you guys a request to start your videos. There we go. Welcome back. And excellent. All right. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been exceptionally insightful. I don't know if you can see me scribbling everything down. The first question is for Paul and Cathy, and it's a question from Rachel Gonzalez, who's a member of our Girls on Boards program. And she asked that given the Canadian economy's deep relationship with the US, how do you believe our interconnection with the US is going to impact our ability to rebound from this crisis? Is there an angle for the nonprofit sector that speaks to that?
Mm-hmm. You want to go first, Paul?
Organizationally, yeah.
You go first, Paul.
Okay, so for me, it's the capital side and the funding side. You know, we one of the challenges is that as Canadians, we don't often talk about the vast difference in the way that funding flows in Canada. It's also the way that it's gathered. This is what we do as an association. CAGP teaches to charities, to actually primarily financial advisors as well, and donors, that Canada has the single greatest tax credit system in the Western world, better than the United States, better than the United Kingdom, and we've been looking at the other two too much. So in this rebuilding, we hope we can, as much as we can, even activate some of these opportunities as Canadians from all different walks of life, for, you know, regular everyday donors to corporate donors to real strategic philanthropists. As they're trying to think about the rebuild, we're hoping that we can help them to do it, take advantage of the benefits. But the first thing we're seeing is we're going to have to dig deep. Digging into capital of foundations, that's not going to be easy. It's not done before. This will be unprecedented. And so this is going to be our current challenge, is how to convince the people who have kind of socked away this money in these different foundations in different places to say it's time to deploy. This is the rainy day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think there's so much to learn and share from each other between the US and Canada. We're an international ally with the US Council, the Council of US Nonprofits, and part of their advocacy and seeing what they're able to accomplish right now in the States with respect to supports for nonprofits and charities, and learning about, you know, what's working, what's not working. So many of the issues we have are exactly the same. What's interesting is that we have very different funding models. There's a lot more foundations and private donors in the States, less government funding. In Canada, there's more government funding for organizations. So in fact, we're better off than our US counterparts right now in terms of some stability and supports. But the US has a better track record of raising private funds and capital more quickly than Canada. So I think there's things to definitely learn from one another, but there's no doubt that the impact on both of our sectors will be quite similar.
Thank you, Cathy. We have a important question here from Gloria R. And again, I'll direct this to Cathy. How well are the federal wage and other subsidies for workers going to apply to the nonprofit and charitable sector?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that question. We've been waiting all week for more details from the federal government. So we have confirmation that the 75% wage subsidy will be open to nonprofits and charities, but I've been advocating literally every day, every hour for more details that actually serve our sector better. So right now there are some rules around showing a 30% reduction in revenue. You know, what does that mean for the sector? On what basis? All revenues or some revenues? So to be honest, the jury is still out until we get those details about how that will impact the sector. If it's flexible, and is tailored to how nonprofits and charities budget cycles work, it could be a huge game changer for the sector to have that 75% wage subsidy, and it will mean that organizations will not lay off staff in the next month. We know that that's just one piece of the puzzle, though. A lot of organizations either don't have staff, or their staff might be paid through other contracts like government that are stable. So we know that we actually need sort of a three-legged stool. We need programs like the wage subsidy. We need philanthropy, as what Paul's talking about, both from Canadians and corporations, and capital from foundations. And we also need a government-funded stabilization fund for nonprofits and charities that will help with the bridge financing to support the recovery. So we need all three of those things. But the wage subsidy specifically won't work for us unless it's tailored. We've been told every day there will be more details, and we haven't received them yet. So I know Imagine Canada, ONN, and many partners are going to be sharing that information the minute we get it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cathy. Yeah, and I think that's that it's important to point out that because we do have different sort of definitions of revenue and budget cycles, that that for a director it'll be important, maybe before sending a screenshot to your executive director, which is what I've been doing, to read the fine print and make sure that it is indeed suitable for nonprofit organizations. And just a follow-up question to that, there's also an opportunity for small business loans of up to $40,000. Cathy, do you have a sense of how useful and helpful that is going to be to the
I think they will be helpful. So they are eligible. Nonprofits and charities are eligible for that as well. So interest-free loans up to $40,000, and 10,000 of that, 25%, doesn't have to be paid back. And so if you're an organization that needs it for cash flow purposes, so for example, you're not going to have a fundraising event anymore in May, but you'll probably try and have one at Christmas, and just need some cash flow, that's a good tool for you for sure. And I know all of the banks, financial institutions, and credit unions are getting set up to support nonprofits to do that. But if you're thinking about it as cash that you don't have to repay, then that's going to be a risk for your organization and a risk for your board to think about. And most bylaws say that boards have to approve loans or taking on debt. So that would be something that organizations would have to discuss with their board.
Thank you for bringing that up. I have a question. I'm going to direct this to Margie. From a governance perspective, this is from Sharmila Setaram. From a governance perspective, I'm wondering if boards are considering delaying or extending board terms, elections, or nominations to ensure stability during this time. Would you recommend that?
Yes, so that's really interesting because yesterday that's exactly what one of my boards decided. We had someone who was coming up with the end of their final term, a director, and we basically said, okay, this, so many things are being delayed because at the moment, and we are going to delay this as well. And the interesting thing is he wasn't terming out until September, but we don't know how long this will last and what kind of impact. So we've said we want to extend him through the end of the year and possibly into next year. I've also been involved with an organization that's delaying their elections, and it depends on the organization. But I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is the stability, for sure. You want that history. But the other is the staff often support those kind of functions, and they are just way too busy to be working on that. Not to say it's not important, but it's to also just free up time and potentially money that the organization could use.
Thank you.
Just to mention that our organization is a real challenge. We had to cancel our conference, which is a real challenge for us. And now we're thinking about virtual AGMs, all of that challenges and the board terms, et cetera. And then the Ontario Nonprofit Network puts out today a whole package on triaging AGMs, changing to virtual and all of that. So a whole bunch of us in the sector have been such a relief today on a Friday to get this and help us triage. So Cathy, please thank your team and let's share those links. It's a godsend at this time.
Thanks, Paul. I got to keep you around to talk about the work.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Paul, actually, we have another question coming in for you from Live Work Play. How can we leverage this awful situation to ensure foundations or other funders can break out of their pattern of wanting to fund projects that will magically, sorry, I should add the quotes that were in this, to fund projects that will be magically sustainable. Funders keep stripping capacity rather than building it by making organizations chase project funding. So how can organizations and board members be advocating for that?
We recently had a conversation with the Toronto Community Foundation where Anne Gloger, the executive director of the East Scarborough storefront, now as well leading an organization called Connected Communities, was talking about this trend over the past 30 years to first fund projects and then outcomes and now impact, and that scope is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is the time, as David said, this is the time to focus on relationships. As Kelly was sharing, now is the time to go out and talk to donors. Well, now is the time to open a discussion with funders to talk to them about what is it you're really trying to have an impact with us on, what is your capacity to give beyond what we've been talking about in the past, and have some real open discussions today to say, in crisis, what do you want to do? Let's talk about what our needs are and break open some of these mindsets that we had before, because truly the scope was getting smaller and smaller. We're going to give you 20 grand and we want to see your entire books. We're going to give you 5,000 and we want to see your entire project funding of 1 million. The scope was getting smaller, the impact was getting smaller. This is a time when frankly, we can all take a step back and open up the structure of funding to have open conversations so that hopefully we can come out of this with a better flow of that funding.
Thanks, Paul. There's a question here about events, and I'll direct it to Salima, given sort of the events focus of the boards you sit on. This question's from Sophia Pezzarini. If our work in the nonprofit focuses primarily on an annual event, would you recommend we wait to see how things develop before taking action on a different direction? Or would you recommend that we reshape our programs in order to provide some services online? Do you think these changes should be permanent? And should we rethink the way we shake up our programs from now on?
So there's a lot there. And so I'll take it in two parts. One, should you think about postponing events, or is it too soon? And then two, should we rethink our program? So on the first one, I would say, I definitely think that from information, even just at the moment, right before this webinar, we were hearing from the Premier that this could last quite a long time. We heard David at the start of the webinar saying that this could go on a long time. So I do think that it is time to start thinking about contingencies, especially if those are large fundraising events. When will we host them? What will we do in the meantime if we can't? I think it's important and prudent for both at the board level and at the staff level to have those kind of conversations happening. For example, in the civic action world, one of our core reasons of being is to bring people together. And that convening role typically happens in person. And so that's a conversation that has been happening a lot at the Civic Action Board table. But what it's led to is new ways of convening. And last night, we actually were able to have a webinar where members of the Emerging Leaders Network, which is one of the programs that Civic Action supports or runs, have an interaction with Mayor Tory. And so I think while we've been thinking about definitely postponing and not letting go of the idea that the in-person connection is important, we've also been open enough to say we still want to deliver content. Our members are still suffering. They need access to power. How can we give that to them? How can we open up lines of communication that we haven't been able to do in the past? And I think last night was a great successful example of that. Just on another note, with the Toronto Foundation last week, one of the things that the chair there has been so focused on is that now is the time for us to continue to do our good work, and echoing the words that Paul is saying, and that's been a very clear message and one that the board has really supported. And so how do we continue to do granting when we typically would sit around a board table to do that? What methods are we going to use in order to review applications, in order to make sure that we are still supporting those that need support when our traditional methods of doing that are no longer available? And so just adapting to new ways, I think, will open up opportunity, but not letting go of the things that gave you great success in the past. And so I think it's just about innovating to the new normal. And I really love those words that Paul said, because I think that when we come out of it, it's not going to look like how it was before.
So that actually leaves me with one more question, and I'd love for everyone to sort of answer this with one thought, if you can. Um, as we come out of this, will nonprofit governance look different? And if so, what is a thing that you think will look different about the way that we, and then increasingly a new generation of young people, are governing nonprofits after this pandemic? Why don't I start with Cathy, because I know she spends a lot of time reimagining governance.
You know, I hope nonprofit governance looks different. I mean, I think there's been a lot of examples of things over the years that we haven't done just because it was, you know, it was the way it was always done. You know, whether it's virtual meetings or technologies, or deciding, you know, who actually needs to make a decision in the moment, like Kelly was so articulate about. And so I do hope that we take this opportunity to reimagine governance and think about, you know, who are all the players in governance in our organization, and what's the role of the board versus the role of other players in governance, and how do we support the staff to do the job that they actually really need to do in the moment. So I think it will help us think through
Sorry, I lost the last thing that you said, Cathy, and I think everyone did. The
I'm
last.
sorry. I hope it will open some new windows of opportunities to think differently about the role of governance and what we specifically need the role of the board to be.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Thank you. Margie, what do you think?
Yes, thanks, because I need to jump onto another call. I completely agree. I think something that Cathy said earlier about parking egos and logos, you know, just this, again, looking for the opportunities. So it'll be different for our organizations as we look at opportunities to partner and be stronger as we rework and retool. And I think I don't really know how it will be different, but I know that right now as a director, I feel closer to my organizations and closer to the people there. So I hope that that lasts, and I think it will mean that we are maybe working together more strongly towards our vision and our mission. So again, don't know exactly how that'll turn out, but it's feeling there's a positive to it.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say goodbye. Sorry. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Margie. Kelly, is there anything that you would add to sort of how nonprofit governance is going to look different after this?
Kelly, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, Kelly, you are on mute. Let's get you off mute. Thanks, Paul.
I think one of the things that it's important for all of us to remember, just in life, of how if COVID-19 can teach us anything, it's if we stay in the position of fear, you know, we're going to see the negatives everywhere, and it's easy to get stuck in those places. And I think for board directors with fiduciary responsibilities that they take seriously, it's easy to get stuck in that fear zone. But if we can move ourselves out of there to see what we can learn from this experience, and how it can help us to grow when we're looking for the opportunities, and we're learning from each other about how to support each other and get through this. I think it's not just for board directors, but I think it's for all of us. Then our compassion comes out, and you know, we're practicing, like we're being open about how we've had to adapt to changes. We're learning from each other. I think, you know, the willingness to partner with other nonprofits rather than to be protective around funding. I think I'm hopeful that we can all get to that place where we grow from this. Board directors, the whole not-for-profit industry and government, and Canadians as a whole, actually.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kelly. And is frozen. Am I frozen? All right, there we go. So Salima and Paul, we are, of course, hitting the very end of this. If there's sort of one word or one thing that will be different in your perspective going forward. Salima?
Resiliency. I think that's going to be top of mind, and I think that's going to be healthy for every organization, whether a nonprofit, business, public. And I just want to take 1 second to plug the Better Toronto Coalition that the Toronto Foundation is hosting 8 a.m. on Thursdays to connect nonprofit leaders with concerned residents. And so that's another outlet to get your messages and your great work out. And so Toronto Foundation.
Yes, and I've been calling into those every single week to learn about how organizations on the front lines are responding, and it's been incredible. The Better Toronto Coalition. Paul, final thoughts?
I'm in Toronto as well and calling in every week to that to the call in. I think folks on the call, wherever you are, community foundations across the country are organizing these kind of responses. But from a capital and a funding perspective, I can tell you before we hit all this, the markets had seen, and we've got the numbers, the Canadian economic numbers to see that the future of philanthropy in Canada is female. We've got the economic numbers, we've got the giving data. TD Bank has recognized this. If you haven't seen the report, Women, Wealth, and Philanthropy, RBC, a number of different capital markets have seen and have the economic and StatsCan data. If our organization, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, CAGP, can help share some of those stats with you and your board to be able to come out of this to take advantage of what was momentum, which we really still will see. The demographics are there. That's what you want to really be leaning into as we come out of this, especially if your cause is connected to women and girls.
So I think that if you want to explore this topic more with Paul, the topic of the future of fundraising is female, send him a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. I think he'll be happy to talk more about it. And to the earlier question we had at the beginning of the call around sort of what kind of skills are going to be valuable at the end of this, it sounds like fundraising will certainly be one of those. So I think that's a really valuable way to think about sort of what your future career in the nonprofit sector can look like, or future career as a board member. So that's a great note to leave on. I'm going to wrap up. As we're wrapping up, please take a look at your screens. I'm going to launch a little poll. We'd love to know what you thought about this webinar, our first. This was our pilot, so welcome everyone to our pilot. We know that I think now more than ever people want to be connecting with one another. I feel every day like I am so hungry to be learning new things and to be stimulated and to be building relationships with people. So we are going to keep these rolling. If you have any ideas about webinars that sort of relate to Girls 20's work, please shoot us an email at info@girls20.org. We are really in brainstorming phase, so send them over. And yeah, if you enjoyed this webinar, you can talk about it online using the hashtag #WithGirls20. That's a hashtag we use for all of our events. And I just want to say a huge thank you to these speakers. Everyone is so busy right now, has so many competing demands, and to spend an hour and a half this afternoon with us talking about governance and making it really interesting has been really wonderful. So thank you so much from all of us at Girls 20. All right. Wishing everyone a good weekend and to take care and stay safe. Thank you.